Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling something pretty heavy.
Yeah,
Corporate influence and political corruption in the U.S.
it's a big one.
Yeah, I've got a whole stack of articles, analysis, even some court documents to get through.
Yeah, a lot to unpack.
So, jumping right in,
Yeah.
what really struck me going through all this material was
Yeah.
how blatant it is. I mean, it's not even subtle.
Oh, it's not. It's really in your face when you start to look at how corporations and special interest groups are using their money.
Oh yeah, it's like follow the money is practically screaming from every page.
It is. And, the sources really lay bare the mechanics of it all, how these groups are wielding their financial might.
To basically get what they want.
Yeah, to influence political decisions, and it's not always pretty.
One article I was looking at mentioned that the pharmaceutical industry spent like $382 million on lobbying just last year.
Yeah, in 2023 alone.
It's crazy, $382 million. Like, what can you even do with that kind of money?
Well, it's not always a direct correlation, but that same year legislation passed that made it much harder
Right.
to import cheaper prescription drugs from Canada.
Oh, wow.
And that directly impacted the affordability of medication for a lot of people, especially people who rely on essential drugs.
So you can actually see the impact. Like, it's not just theoretical.
Right. You can trace the money and see how it ripples out and affects people's lives in a very real way.
That's a good point. You mentioned super PACs, too. I got to admit, I'm still a little fuzzy on those.
Super PACs, think of them as political action committees, but like supercharged. The Citizens United versus FEC decision back in 2010 really changed the game.
That's the one that, like, corporations spend unlimited amounts on elections, right?
Exactly. And often with very little transparency about where the money's actually coming from.
So basically, they can just pump tons of money into campaigns without us knowing who's really behind it.
Yeah, it's what people call dark money. It
Oh.
casts a big shadow over our elections.
It's kind of scary when you think about it. So how does lobbying fit into all this?
Lobbying's a bit more direct. Individuals or groups engage directly with lawmakers,
Okay.
provide them with information, and, advocate for policies that benefit their interests.
So it's like they have someone on the inside pushing their agenda.
Right. You could say that.
Hmm.
And it's not just at the federal level either.
You mean it's happening at the state and local level, too?
Oh, yeah, it's happening everywhere.
Okay.
City councils, school boards, even environmental regulations.
Wow, so this is hitting way closer to home than most people realize.
It is, and it's shaping decisions that affect our daily lives in very real ways.
So it's not just some abstract political game. This is actually impacting people's lives.
That's exactly right. Now, some people argue that, interest groups and lobbying can be a good thing.
Really? How so?
Well, they say it can represent diverse voices, make sure everyone gets a seat at the table, but the
Uh-huh.
reality is that the system as it is now favors those with the deepest pockets.
So basically, whoever has the most money gets to shout the loudest.
Pretty much, and that drowns out the voices of ordinary citizens.
So we've talked about how this influence works in theory, but do we have any, like, real-world examples?
Absolutely. I think the recent case of former Senator Bob Menendez really highlights this.
Oh, yeah, the Menendez case. That was a big one.
He was convicted on 16 counts.
Bribery, extortion, the whole nine yards.
Exactly. And the details are pretty shocking. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes, gold bars, stacks of cash, luxury goods.
I remember reading about that. They found almost $500,000 stuffed in boots at his house.
480,000 to be exact. Stuffed in boots and clothing along with those gold bars. It's pretty brazen.
It makes you wonder, are some politicians even trying to represent the people, or are they just in it for themselves?
It definitely raises some questions, and the implications of his actions go way beyond just him personally.
That's what I was thinking. The sources all emphasize that this kind of behavior has really wide-reaching consequences.
Exactly. This isn't just about a few bad apples. It's about how this undue influence can warp the entire system.
So let's talk about those consequences.
Mm-hmm.
What does this mean for the average person? What are the real-world effects of letting corporate influence run rampant? I mean, it's got to have some kind of impact on everyday people.
It does. It erodes public trust when we see these cases like Menendez. It just reinforces this idea that politicians are corrupt.
Yeah, like they're just out for themselves.
Right. And that cynicism, it's really corrosive. It leads to people being apathetic, they disengage, and ultimately it weakens our democracy.
Because if you think the system's rigged, why even bother voting?
Exactly. It creates the sense of powerlessness and disillusionment, But beyond the political implications, there are real-world consequences, too.
Like what kind of consequences?
Well, think about it. Policies can be skewed to favor corporate profits over things that really matter, like the environment, public health workers' rights.
You mean things like having clean air and water-safe products, fair working conditions?
Exactly. Those are the things that directly impact our lives. For
Yeah,
example, if a powerful industry lobby manages to weaken environmental regulations, that could lead to dirtier air in your city, and that impacts your family's health.
that's scary. And what about those relaxed safety standards I was reading about?
Yeah, if lobbying efforts result in products being less safe, that puts consumers at risk.
It's pretty unsettling when you think about it. It's not just a political game, it's our health, our safety, our well-being.
And often the people who are hit the hardest are those who are already most vulnerable.
You mean like low-income communities, people who are already struggling?
Exactly. The sources we looked at really highlight how corporate influence can exacerbate existing inequalities.
So it's contributing to the growing gap between the rich and the poor.
It is. If policies are shaped to favor those with money and power, then the system is inherently unfair to those who are struggling to get by.
So it's like a vicious cycle that's hard to break.
It can be. But, okay, I know we've painted a pretty bleak picture here. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in. But is there anything we can do about it? Can we push back against this influence?
There are things we can do. The sources actually offer some hope. They outline several strategies that could make a difference.
Like what?
Well, one key area is campaign finance reform.
I think I saw something about that Senator Hawley proposed a bill to limit corporate spending in elections, right?
Yeah, that's a good example. Limiting how much money corporations can pour into campaigns could help level the playing field.
That makes sense.
Hmm.
But I'm guessing it's not that simple.
It's not. It's a step in the right direction, but it's not a silver bullet. We also need more transparency.
Transparency in what way?
Transparency in lobbying and political spending. We need to know who's trying to influence our elected officials and how much money they're using to do it.
So basically shine a light on all the backroom deals.
Exactly. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. When we can see where the money's going and who's benefiting, it's much harder for these things to happen in secret.
Okay, I get it. So more transparency would help, but are there any actual initiatives that aim to do that?
There are groups pushing for legislation that would require more disclosure of lobbying activities and political spending.
So we could actually see who's lobbying who and how much they're spending.
Right. It would make it much harder for these interactions to happen in the shadows.
Okay, that sounds promising. But what about us regular people? Can we really make a difference against these powerful forces?
Absolutely. We shouldn't underestimate the power of grassroots movements. There are organizations like Represent Us that are working to mobilize citizens and advocate for anti-corruption measures.
I've heard of them. What kind of things are they pushing for?
They're working on things like independent redistricting commissions to combat gerrymandering, which often benefits incumbents and those with money and influence.
So it's about getting involved, staying informed, and working together to make a change.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we the people still have power. Even small actions can make a difference.
Like contacting our representatives, attending town hall meetings, donating to organizations like Represent Us.
Right. It's all about taking ownership of our democracy and not letting it be hijacked by special interests.
You know, it's interesting. We often talk about this as a fight against something against corruption, against corporate influence.
Yeah.
But maybe it's helpful to think about what we're fighting for as well.
That's a great point. We're fighting for a democracy that truly represents the people, where everyone has an equal voice and where decisions are made in the best interests of the public good.
It's about reclaiming our government and making sure it's accountable to us, the citizens, not just to special interests.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
about creating a system that's transparent and equitable. A system that works for everyone, not just a select few.
So we've talked about the dark side of corporate influence, but
Mhm.
are there ever times when it can be a good thing?
That's a good question. And the answer is yes. Sometimes lobbying efforts can lead to positive outcomes,
Okay, I'm moving.
like advancements in healthcare or environmental protection. But the problem is that the current system is so skewed towards those with financial resources that it creates an uneven playing field.
So it's not about eliminating lobbying altogether. It's about making sure the system is fair.
Exactly. We need to make sure that all voices can be heard, not just those with the deepest pockets.
It's about leveling the playing field and making sure our elected officials are truly representing the people they're supposed to represent.
That's the goal.
All right, so we've spent quite a bit of time talking about, the downsides of corporate influence and political corruption.
Ah, the not so pretty stuff.
Yeah, and it can get Pretty depressing, honestly.
You can.
But we ended the last part talking about collective action and, the power of people pushing back. So I'm really curious to hear about some real-world examples of that.
Yeah, there are some really inspiring stories out there, people finding ways to make their voices heard even when the system feels stacked against them.
Okay, so what do you have for us?
One that really stood out to me was this group of parents in a small town. They took on a huge corporation that was polluting their water supply.
Oh, wow. Talk about David and Goliath. What
This
happened?
So this company had been dumping toxic waste into the river for years.
Oh, no.
And it was starting to have some serious health consequences for the people living there, especially the kids.
Oh, man.
And these parents, a lot of them had no experience with activism or anything like that. They just decided enough was enough.
So what did they do?
They organized protests. They started contacting their elected officials. They even filed a lawsuit against the company.
Wow, so they went all in. They weren't messing around.
They were not. And their efforts paid off. They managed to get a settlement that forced the company to clean up the pollution and compensate the community for the harm that had been done.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
It just goes to show you that even ordinary people can make a difference when they come together and stand up for what's right.
it really does. Another example that I found really interesting was the fight for campaign finance reform at the state level.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about that. What's been happening there?
In some states, citizens have been pushing for these small donor matching systems.
Okay, and how do those work?
Basically, they amplify the power of small donations by matching them with public funds.
So if I donate $5, the state matches it with another $5.
Exactly. It helps level the playing field and reduces the influence of big donors and special interest groups.
So it gives more power back to the people.
Right. And it's been successful in some places. One state that implemented this saw a big jump in the number of small donors contributing to campaigns.
Oh, wow, so it actually worked.
It did. And it also led to a more diverse pool of candidates running for office because they weren't so reliant on wealthy donors anymore.
That's really encouraging. I guess what I'm hearing is that, we don't have to accept the status quo. There are things we can do to change the system.
There are. But of course, these reforms face a lot of pushback from those who benefit from the way things are now.
Yeah, I can imagine.
There are powerful forces that want to keep their grip on power, but these examples show that change is possible.
So what can we do? How can we support these efforts?
Well, as we talked about before, staying informed is key. We need to understand the issues, know who our elected officials are, and be aware of the organizations that are working for change.
And then once we're informed, we can decide how we want to get involved.
Exactly. Some people might be drawn to more direct activism, like protests or town hall meetings. Others might prefer to support organizations financially or volunteer their time. There are lots of ways to contribute.
It's funny. We often talk about this as a fight against something,
Right.
a fight against corruption, a fight against corporate influence. But maybe it's helpful to also think about what we're fighting for.
That's a good point. We're fighting for a democracy that truly represents the people, a democracy where everyone has an equal voice and where decisions are made to benefit everyone, not just a select few.
It's about taking back our government and making sure it serves the people.
Exactly.
Well, I think this has been a really insightful deep dive. We've gone from, the mechanics of corporate influence to its real-world consequences, and then to the hope of collective action and the possibility of change.
Yep.
I agree. It's been a great conversation.
And hopefully it's given our listeners a better understanding of this complex issue and maybe even inspired them to get involved in some way.
I hope so, because at the end of the day, the future of our democracy depends on us. It depends on our willingness to engage, to speak up, and to demand a system that truly reflects the will of the people.
And on that note, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive into corporate influence and political corruption.
Thanks for having me.
It was great talking to you.
Yeah.
And to all of our listeners out there, thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
Remember, stay informed, stay engaged, and keep fighting the good fight.